Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and as always, it is such a pleasure to be able to see you once again. I hope you're all well and in good spirits. And I would like to share with you some thoughts that I have with respect to another film or a fragment of a film that can be found in this particular curated series or set of films called Pioneers of African American Cinema. Today I'd like to talk about the film which is called By Right of Birth. This is a film from 1921. By Right of Birth is from the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And the name Lincoln Motion Picture Company is one that we should remember, and I'll try to speak a little bit more about that in a moment. We should also point out two other names that I think are very significant in a discussion of the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. One is Noble Johnson, and the other is George Johnson. And they are brothers, and both are directly related to this production company called the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And with respect to this film, By Right of Birth, in particular, George Johnson's contribution is quite significant. But once again, I'll try to speak a little bit to that later on in this video. We should point out also that the only surviving fragment that we have of this film, or indeed of any other film from the Lincoln Motion Picture Film Company, is this fragment, which is the 4-minute fragment of this film By Right of Birth. Now, according to the booklet here, the back, this is described as being a precious 4-minute clip that represents the only surviving work of the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, founded in 1916 by brothers Noble and George Johnson. And so this fragment is not meant to be the entire film of By Right of Birth. And perhaps for those of you who have seen this fragment, you can probably guess from the nature of the fragment that there is a lot of stuff that is not there. There seems to be a suggestion of a story involving land leases, and also missing persons, and also secret identities or discovery of identities. The attempt to have financial gain at the expense of others, something to do with rental or real property. There is a detective. There is also a young woman, and there's a scene involving her on horseback, and there's a little bit of trouble with her falling off her horse and needing assistance, and things of that nature. And so what we get from this fragment are mere hints of what would have been, of course, the entire film. But once again, according to the materials that we have available to us in this booklet, for example, which is included in the Kino set, and also in the scholarship, which is represented in the works that I have listed in the bibliography or suggested reading list, which can be found in the description box below. This is the only surviving fragment copy of this film, and thus it's the only thing that we can see in cinema form as to the work that came out of this company, which is called the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. This therefore becomes one of two things. It can either be seen as being an unfortunate situation in that we only get this surviving fragment and we don't get this or any of the other films in a complete or near complete form from the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And in that sense, of course, it is a tragedy, because we are, of course, missing out on what I understand is an incredibly interesting part of American cinema history during this early period, the late 19-teens going into the early 1920s. So in that sense, we are missing out on a lot, and therefore it is a shame that, as of now anyway, we aren't able in today's age to be able to enjoy any surviving prints or any other surviving fragments or remnants. But at the same time, my friends, we should remember that this is also a very delicate thing, this medium called cinema. And that we have something that is surviving at all, I think, is also cause for celebration. And we can look at this also as a positive thing. And I think the way it's treated in this set and by the curators, Professors Jacqueline Stewart and Charles Musser, Jacqueline Njuba Stewart and Professor Charles Musser, the way it's treated here as curated in the set is, I think, one of a positive thing, in that this is something that we can still today watch and observe and enjoy and appreciate, albeit in a fragmented form, of course, but still having something is better than having nothing at all. And the word precious is used by the booklet, and I think that's a very appropriate word to be using here. This is something very precious. This is therefore something that we can value and watch and learn from and really marvel at when we watch this. And so we might not necessarily be able, from the fragment alone, to be able to get a sense of the full richness and robust quality of the story that was trying to be told by the Lincoln Motion Picture Company and George Johnson and crew. However, we can get a sense of the cinematic craft that's going into this film, and we can get a sense of the types of matters and situations and issues that were at the heart of films like this by right of birth, and also by extension the films that we can imagine that were coming from the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. Now, I should point out that the Lincoln Motion Picture Company is very significant because it is known to be the first, or at least one of the first, motion picture companies that came into existence in the late teens, 19-teens. The scholarship indicates 1916 when it was founded. But this was one of the first, if not the first, motion picture company that was owned by African Americans. And we have this information from the scholarship. As I say, it's listed in the description box below the suggested reading list. But we have information about this from the scholarship, and also we understand that the enterprise or the business was established by Noble Johnson, who was himself an actor, and other African-American businessmen. And also we should point out that the scholarship also indicates that Harry Gant, who is also indicated as being involved, and he is a white filmmaker, and in fact his name is mentioned as being the director of By Right of Birth. So he was involved as well. But please note that the Lincoln Motion Picture Company is known and recognized as being one of, if not the first, African-American owned motion picture companies. And Noble Johnson, and as well as the involvement of his brother George Johnson, were trying through this company to create films that were focusing on stories and depicting characters that were somehow, through the medium of cinema and the stories that they were telling, trying to say something or depicting something that was truthful or accurate, or somehow or another an honest depiction of African American characters and African American living. And the stories that were told in the films that were made by the Lincoln Motion Picture Company seem to suggest this. Now, I should say from the outset, once again, that we have very little surviving materials as far as the actual films are concerned. And so this makes the scholarship, I think, very important to look at and to read and to try to get an idea as to what these films were and what the Lincoln Motion Picture Company was trying to do with these films, what they were about, etc. So, in fact, we are very fortunate that we have scholarship in some of the texts here that help us to, that describe what the films were and what the general history of the Lincoln Motion Picture Company was. And so based off of the scholarship, we can get a better idea of Lincoln Motion Picture Company, its aims and ambitions, and what it was trying to do, and indeed what it did during its short yet still very productive tenure. So this makes the reading of the scholarship, the texts that are available, some of which are listed in the bibliography below, but there are many others. And so I strongly, strongly recommend, if at all possible, to read these materials about Lincoln Motion Picture Company, in addition to watching the fragment that is made available through this set as it appears in Blu-ray form, or maybe streaming form, or whatever the case may be for you in your particular situation, because there is a lot there's a lot of information that's provided in the scholarship texts and the academic texts about what Lincoln Motion Picture Company was, what it achieved, what it tried to achieve, and what were the circumstances that it faced during its short lifespan. Because, as I say, it was active from 1916 till about the early 1920s. And during that time, it had made 5 films, at least that's according to the historical records. And the films were The Realization of a Negro's Ambition, 1916, The Trooper of Troop K, 1916. Professor Stewart describes it as being 1916. I've seen other texts and sources that describe it as being from 1917, but I'll go with Professor Stewart's labeling of it as 1916. So that's The Trooper of Troop K. And then there's The Law of Nature, from 1917. And let's stop there. So already in its early tenure, and its early activity during these first couple years of its existence, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company was making films that were made with African American casts, that had stories that centered or focused on African American characters, their concerns, their particular the issues with respect to their particular stories, that tended to focus on middle-class life and the concept of working hard and trying to make a living and trying to figure out and realize a certain character arc that were seen by many audiences at the time as being very positive depictions of African Americans in cinema. And in fact, these films that were made and that were shown to theaters that had African American audiences, these films, according to the historical record, were very popular both critically and commercially. So they were very popular when they were shown in the theaters and venues that had African American audiences, and also the historical records show that newspapers had or published very favorable reviews of these films, and they were heralded as being films that were really showing real honest depictions of African Americans on screen that might not necessarily have been seen in other similar works that we might have discussed earlier. For instance, there is something of an issue even now in the scholarship as to whether, say, the Ebony Film Corporation films were really honest and positive depictions of African Americans on screen, or perhaps they weren't. Again, there's a debate about that, as we've discussed in previous videos, and other films of that similar nature. Well, when compared to those films, at least at the time, the films from Lincoln Motion Picture Company were therefore welcomed with open arms from the theater and cinema critical press, at least according to the historical record, the African American critical press, and also the audiences. And so this therefore is a really important company in that it was very groundbreaking in that respect. And so this was an effort, or a company that was really trying to make films that were, as I say, being shown in theaters and venues that had African American audiences. Now, this therefore meant that the audiences for these films among the African American community was growing, and it was considered to be these films were considered, therefore, in that respect, to be quite successful. However, we should point out a number of circumstances that have been cited by the scholarship. And again, this is another way for me to try to urge you to take a look at the scholarship. It is really wonderful, excellent, and it explains it much better and much more thoroughly than I could ever hope to try to do in a particular video. And these scholars and academics have really worked with these films. They have done the research, they have spent many days, months, years on films like this to explore them and to study them and to write about them. And so please, if you can, take a look at some of the hard work of the scholars that have been writing about these films, and some of their works and names are listed in the description box below. Again, strongly recommended, because as I say, there is very little in terms of a cinematic record of Lincoln Motion Picture Company, and therefore we really have to rely on all the materials that we can get, both academic and scholarship and otherwise. So I encourage you to take a look at some of the scholarship which is listed below. But according to the scholarship, this situation of Lincoln Motion Picture Company all the way up through 1918, after it had made its first 3 films, saw that it was having critical and commercial success among the African American community, which was a good thing. Of course, it was an excellent thing, because we were seeing, or the people were appreciating, that these films were in some way really helping to create positive depictions of African Americans on screen that usually relied upon middle class characters, or characters in the middle class that were working, that were trying to achieve character arcs that related to working hard and a strong work ethic, that are of course very positive depictions of characters on screen, and among other things, among other positive traits, of course. But there were a number of circumstances during this period that perhaps can be seen by a number of scholars to have led to the eventual discontinuation of the company and its closure in the early 1920s. And so, for example, if we look at Clyde R. Taylor's essay, which is called Black Silence in the Politics of Representation, which is found in the collection of essays which is called Oscar Micheaux and His Circle, African American Filmmaking and Race Cinema of the Silent Period, which is listed below. One of the paradoxes that is cited in the scholarship is that, on the one hand, these films were being catered, or not catered, where they were being made and shown to African American audiences in theaters and venues that had African American viewership. And so that meant that they were, of course, receiving a lot of positive reaction from these theaters. However, their showings in theaters and venues of white audiences was not as prevalent. And so that meant, therefore, that as a paradox, the films from the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, while they had distribution in theaters that of black audiences, they did not have distribution with theaters with white audiences. And if we remember, at least according to Clyde R. Taylor, if we remember this time as still being a period of segregation, this notion of segregation also played itself out in movie theaters and theater venues. And so we had we had theaters that had black audiences, and we had theaters that had white audiences. And so, as a paradox, while the films from the Lincoln Motion Picture Company were shown in the theaters that had black audience viewership, they weren't being shown in theaters that had white audience viewership. And so ultimately, that meant that when costs were beginning to get higher for movie production, as the film productions were leaving the teens and entering into the 1920s, costs were rising. And also we have to remember that there was more competition from other films of a similar kind of genre or a similar type of entertainment that often involved African American casts. So there was more competition. There were also certain labor shortages and other cost-related issues as well that were related to the participation of the United States in World War I in the late teens, late 19-teens. And also in 1918, Noble Johnson, who I referred to as being a very popular actor, he often appeared in the early Lincoln Motion Picture Company films, is very well known. He resigned from the company in 1918, and the reason behind that, according to the scholarship, was that he was under contract at Universal, the Universal production company. And so it's understood, according to the scholarship, that I think he was forced to resign from Lincoln Motion Picture Company in order to pursue his acting career at Universal. And so he appears and so he made a name for himself as an actor in other Hollywood productions. But unfortunately, what that meant was that he had to leave, or he had to resign from Lincoln Motion Picture Company in 1918. And so the managerial and leadership duties then fell to his brother, George Johnson, who made, I think, according to the scholarship anyway, he made a very good and valiant effort to try to continue on with the traditions that were already set up at the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And so under his leadership and managerial leadership, there were two more films that were made, one in 1919 called A Man's Duty, and then one in 1921 called By Right of Birth, which is the film whose fragment we have included as part of this collection, curated collection, Pioneers of African American Cinema. And in fact, if we look at the credits which are included here, we see it's directed by Harry Gant. And as I mentioned before, Harry Gant was a gentleman who was a white filmmaker, but who was also involved in Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And also this says to be a story by George Johnson and stars Clarence Brooks, Anita Thompson, and Webb King. And so this is a film, therefore, that was the last film that was made by Lincoln Motion Picture Company. So By Right of Birth in 1921 was unfortunately the last film that this company, Lincoln Motion Picture Company, made. And then it was only shortly after that that the company discontinued and it ceased to pursue its filmmaking operations, and so it ended. And so we have the short yet still very productive tenure of Lincoln Motion Picture Company from 1916 all the way up to the last film it released in early 1920s, By Right of Birth. And so there were a lot of circumstances, I think, that went into its success and its eventual closing. And I think we can see a lot of that in the scholarship. And in fact, going back to the scholarship by Clyde R. Taylor, Clyde R. Taylor makes an interesting point about how, on the one hand, there is a paradoxical effect going on here. On the one hand, it was very healthy and it was really exciting that Lincoln Motion Picture Company was making films that were directed towards black audiences and that were shown in venues and theaters that had black viewerships, which was a great thing, because we were seeing positive reinforcements of characters depicted on screen, which was, as I say, a welcome thing during this period, especially after considering the circumstances of the historical context that we've described in previous videos during this time. And so these films were, of course, welcomed, and they were positively received, again, from African American audiences. But that also meant that while there were attempts by George Johnson and others to try to gain a wider audience, to try to have these films distributed to other theaters, those efforts, unfortunately, did not lead anywhere. And so these films did not get distribution in theaters that had white audiences. And so while there were efforts made, and in fact, I think according to the scholarship, according to Sampson, I think the to Henry Sampson, Luther Pollard, who was Ebony Film Corporation, as you recall. There was one of the descriptions by Sampson about Luther Pollard was that Luther Pollard's efforts, or one of his efforts, was trying to get a wider distribution opportunities made available to the films of Lincoln Motion Picture Company. Now, that's again according to Sampson, and as we know, Luther Pollard is a somewhat of a controversial figure in the discussion of pioneers of African American cinema. But the point that I wanted to bring up about this was that there were attempts, I think, by George Johnson and others to try to get a wider audience for these films in order to really promote them and to really promote these positive images of African American characters and the stories that were being depicted. Unfortunately, though, as I say, those efforts did not find success, and that combined with rising costs and also larger competitions meant that it became financially unsustainable for Lincoln Motion Picture Company to survive. So a lot of the scholarship, including that by Clyde R. Taylor, is suggesting, I think very reasonably so, that there was already a kind of uneven playing field in the sense that Lincoln Motion Picture Company was limited in its resources. It was doing great stuff. It was doing great films, and it was making great things, and it was positively received. But unfortunately, the financial situation was such that the circumstances did not allow for kind of continued sustenance in terms of production activities beyond the early 1920s. And so unfortunately that meant the end of Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And so this perhaps suggests something that was maybe inherent in the way in which theaters were operating, and how this kind of segregated situation in terms of white theaters and black theaters really meant that while there was great viewership, still there were issues of a financial kind, and these still needed to be resolved in a way that could still make productions financially sustainable. And unfortunately for Lincoln Motion Picture Company, the circumstances were not in its favor, and so that meant it had to end production activities in the early 1920s. Also, unfortunately, as I say, we don't have that much in the way of cinematic examples of what it is what they made. We only have descriptions provided by the scholarship, and also we have, for example, this fragment of By Right of Birth. And granted, it's a short fragment, and it might not necessarily itself be so clear as to what story is being told, but we can see, as I was trying to indicate earlier, glimpses of a story involving a young woman who's on horseback, and she meets another man, and there's a detective, and then there's an interesting thing about shoes, and there's a little episode in an office, and something to do with leases and money, and trying to find a particular person to get a particular lease for some kind of financial scheme of some sort. So there was obviously a really, and something to do with identity. And so there was, and we can get further descriptions of the story itself from the scholarship. And so if you're interested in plot synopses that are very detailed about what this film is about, and other films by Lincoln Motion Picture Company, once again, I urge you to take a look at the scholarship, because a lot of the scholarship, which is based on newspaper records of the day, for instance, that describe the plots, etc. These are really great indicators of what we would have seen had we been able to see the full or nearly full versions of these films. And so that's another plea from me to you to check out the scholarship if you can. But my point is that it's, again, we have very little in terms of what we can actually see, but that again makes what we have a very important and precious thing indeed. And so we can get glimpses and we can get ideas of what these concerns were and how these films were artistically trying to achieve and address these concerns on film. And I think when we see the fragment, or the small fragment that is by right of birth, which is included in the set, I think we can get a real sense of that. And so I urge you to take a look at this fragment again, and also try to check out the scholarship and commentary and academic discussions that have been had with respect to Lincoln Motion Picture Company and By Right of Birth, and also Noble Johnson and George Johnson and others in that circle. And hopefully we, through that, can get an even further better appreciation of how important Lincoln Motion Picture Company really was in the context of pioneers of African American cinema. And so with that, my friends, this is my brief discussion of By Right of Birth from 1921. And so, as I say, it is a fragment only, and it's about 4 minutes. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not long, but it is still incredibly important. Once again, the word that is used very appropriately is precious. This is a precious piece of treasure that we should really watch over and over again, and really appreciate as an example of the hard work and dedication that went into the films produced by Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And so this is from 1921. This is By Right of Birth. And once again, my friends, I have to emphasize that I am in no way an expert when it comes to this area of cinematic history. And so this is once again my way of trying to urge you to ask you to please take a look at the scholarship and try to track down one or more of these books. And through them, you can get a further appreciation of Lincoln Motion Picture Company in this period of cinema history from experts and scholars who are much more intelligent than I. So I once again recommend strongly to take a look at some of the books that are listed down below. From there, you'll find other bibliographies, of course, that will lead you yet to other sources. And I think the journey can progress accordingly. So once again, let's remember these names: Noble Johnson, George Johnson, and Lincoln Motion Picture Company. Once again, these are from pioneers of African American cinema. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you once again, my dear friends, as always, for your time. I know your time is precious. I know your time is important. So I appreciate it as always. And until we meet again, my friends, cheers.